So before I get going with the rest of the analysis, there's one other theme I wanted to touch on, and that's the theme of language in this story. And I think there's one obvious sense in which language is important here, just the naming system, the magic system. There's also this close parallel with language and meaning, with magic and consequences in this. So maybe in a philosophical sense, right? If you make an utterance, if you say something, meaning gets created in the world. In order for that meaning to be interpreted correctly, there needs to be an appropriate context, right? And the relevant conventions in which that utterance was spoken need to be employed to be interpreted correctly. And in a very similar sense, right, we have Ogion instructing Get to appreciate the context, the accepted conventions as well, of living biotic forms, right? How one plant exists in relation to other vegetation and in relation to other plants and animals. The same way, that a word or a phrase exists in relation to conventions, worldviews, context. These considerations have an impact on what was said, just as the forms, the living forms, have an impact or a say in what was done, what the consequences were. So in summary, Ged doesn't alone get to decide the consequences of his actions, just in the same way that one can't assume to mean something by their intentions alone, right? Just what you intended isn't the only thing that matters when you make an utterance. Everything else that happened because of that is the consequence. That's the meaning, and how it affects others. They get to judge too what the consequences were. This is something kind of Ged doesn't seem to realize. One can't assume to mean something by their intentions alone. Just as Ged can't intend to raise the dead and assume that the only action he's responsible for is raising the dead. He's responsible for all the ripple effects of that action. The way it affects others, they actually have a say in the consequences. They have a say in how to interpret the meaning, right? Just like language. And to take it a little further, so even if the intentions of the speaker are realized, right? In other words, the intentions of the speaker's meaning coincide with the actual interpretation and understanding of people listening, there could still be unintentional meaning that gets carried along with that utterance, right? Because meaning itself is kind of diffuse. And once again, in the same way, Ged realizes that even though he did the thing he intended, right, raising the dead spirit, there were unintended consequences that followed along with it. He's responsible for all that. And he's responsible for how others wish to interpret that. Because consequences, just like meaning, are diffuse. And so Ged's original philosophy is just perform what he wants. But what he's learning is just like you would learn maybe as you're growing up, that language has unintended consequences even if you correctly realize your intentions. It's not up to you to decide, right? It's up to the world to decide. And if that's still not enough, after an utterance has been made, or in this case, Ged has cast his spell. So there's actually a philosophical position called like moderate actual intentionalism. And what this says is that the actual intentions of the speaker, of the utterer, will be called upon to fix meaning once relevant conventions and context have been taken into consideration. They've been accounted for. So if everything's been accounted for, and there's still, let's say, some ambiguity remaining in what was said, then you can call on the intentions of the speaker to pin meaning down, to fix it. Once again, I realize that this is probably stretching it really far at this point. But similarly, Ogion does have a conception of intentions. And pretty much what he says is actually there's only one correct intention for the wizard, and that's necessity. So after everything is said and done, once you collect, you sum up all the consequences you've committed, the only intention that should be used to fix meaning is necessity. If you didn't do that, you're wrong. So continuing on with the actual analysis now. Ged wakes up in the Tower of Turin after this flight, and Serret is there. She's the lady of the tower. And she's hospitable, But Ged feels this overwhelming kind of sense of shame. And she wants Ged to relax. And by relax, I think she is intending to placate the shame that he feels at having fled his shadow, right? At having fled his pride. And in a sense, she's telling him, don't beat yourself up about it. It's not a big deal. Ged's problem with this view, however, and I think it's the correct one, is that this could be interpreted as, don't mind that your pride and arrogance are so strong in you that you had to flee them. Don't worry about that. Just relax, calm down. Ged knows that the shame that he feels right in this moment is the correct emotion. He doesn't want to accept this benign offer to placate his shame, lest by accepting his shame, he get lured into complacency about his pride, about his shadow. Right? He doesn't want to be lured into a sense of complacency and just sort of accept his shadow and sort of accept his pride. No, he knows the shame is the rational emotion. It's the proper emotion. And the only way to get rid of that is to change, because he aspires to challenge, to fight, and conquer his shadow, not accept it as just a natural state. He doesn't want to ever enter a state of mind where his overbearing pride is normal or not something to beat himself up about. It sounds like what Serret's trying to do is just be generous, be hospitable. But I think ultimately it will drive Ged into an incorrect emotion. And as we learn later, that she is kind of under the sway of the shadow. And also you have to remember she's an enchantress. And so he resists this, and he's very good at resisting this. And then as he stays, we see Ged immediately notice that Serret's just a young woman, and she's coveted by this old man. But she's trapped in this world. And there's this idea that she's just an item, an object to this guy. And we get this line, a silver ring on an old man's finger. So that's what she is to the lord of this tower, just a prize. In this tower actually hides an old ancient shadow. This is probably what was calling to Ged. It's also what's beguiling even the enchantress and the lord. And Serret, you can tell she doesn't like the state of affairs that she's trapped to. And unfortunately, in her retreat, she has entrusted herself to this dark shadow that resides in an old ancient stone. She's telling Ged, ask it questions, trust it. And Ged kind of answers, no, I actually fear this stone. I know what's in it. I've seen it firsthand. He's got scars to prove it. And she kind of sneers at this, right? Remember the earlier conversation they had where she tests him and he boasts. But here, he's changed. He's different. On the surface, what she's saying in any other book sounds so wise. And so what's happening is very subtle. She tells him, what one does not know, one fears. But you have nothing to fear here in the court of Tyranid. A weaker man would, indeed, but not you. Ged also knows that you don't fear it, Serret, because you're ignorant of what it is. That's what's giving you this fictitious veneer of courage. It's not real. What Ged fears is not his life. That's in some sense what I think Serret thinks that he fears, your life. A weaker man would fear for his life. You wouldn't. Ged, your power. You could overcome it. But Ged knows, no, that's not what I fear. So she is actually misunderstanding Ged. What he fears is the unknown, the unintended consequences, the disruption of a balance that he knows in his mind I could never fix, right? He couldn't even save that kid from death. There's no point in dabbling with this magic. Ged knows there's a give and take, right? You can't just have all shadow. There has to be something to balance that out. He's learned this price. Ged asks her, what do you know the price of communicating with this shadow? She replies, there is none. Obviously, Ged's like, that's not true. He tells her, it is very hard for evil to control the unconsenting soul. She's allowed it to control her will. She's accepted these wicked motives. It's in her. There's no evil in the world. Evil doesn't exist except within people. There's evil because she is being evil. There's a shadow that Ged is loose because he performed evil and bad consequences arose because of that action. And so they can't restrain Ged. He won't allow it to come under its sway. He won't ask it questions. And Bindorus, he's the lord of the tower, he comments on this, and they try to stop him. And Ged just like, restrains him easily. It's no big deal. Ged's got it. And Serret actually flees with him. So there's some turmoil in her. They encounter 2 guards. And Serret uses magic and kills them. And it's very subtle. Ged seems to disapprove of this. He asks, what did you do? He doesn't really cast judgment. And she says something like, she put acid into their blood or their bones, and they're going to die. Like, she's certain. And you can tell, like, Ged is, I didn't do that. So even though these people were not the greatest, they were trying to detain them, Ged wouldn't have performed this brutal action because she has consented to evil. She's capable of these things. And Ged once was, but he's not. He's changing. It is unfortunate. She's corrupted by these beliefs. She's also consumed by her shadow. She's adopted an evil mindset. She willfully disregards consequences of her actions. She's submitted maybe to some sort of power, maybe just have some sort of an outlet. And she's just a vessel for evil. And you also have to remember, Ged was free to choose. He had the ability to choose. Serret really didn't. He's starting to develop this ability to make clear decision making, right? He was able to resist the shadow this time. Why? Well, because he had a choice, because he wasn't driven by any emotion that the shadow offered. And there is this emphasis too in a lot of the Guin's writing as walls and castles, as closed off belief systems. And because they're closed off, they tend to be corrupt because they don't grow with time. Very much like a hard-headed, stubborn mindset. It just doesn't change. It's a castle, right? You're locked in there. And remember, Serret was in a tower, locked in there, locked into this mindset, unable to escape. And it's interesting because when Ged and Serret are fleeing the tower, there's a gate after she's killed the guards. There's this moment where they're outside and Ged sees the gate right there. But Serret can't see it. Being psychologically trapped, she doesn't see an outlet. She's so consumed in some sense by this stubborn, evil mindset. What's the pathway out? She can't see a gate. There's no clear direction for her. Ged can see the gate though. Why? Well, because he doesn't have this trapped, stubborn mindset. He has accepted the willingness to change. And he also didn't drive himself to such a point where he felt that there was no return. And there is a line that references this idea of castles as trapped belief. It says, "The old powers will not cross over the sea, being bound each to an isle, a certain place, cave or stone, or wellspring or welling spring." And so what happens is they're fleeing, they get outside the gate, and they're assaulted by these dark flying creatures, and they're like, "Hey, let's turn the birds and get out of here." So they start to fly, but Ged just gets this rage. He just can't stand these creatures. And this is a badass scene. He's gonna fight. And he starts attacking him. And it's working. Literally, yeah, he's fighting creatures, but the internal conflict is he's no longer running. He didn't accept the shame. He didn't accept what Serret tried to offer earlier. And she doesn't stay and fight though. She goes through her moment of running, and she turns into a bird and she flies. Ged flies after her and realizes eventually when he gets out over the sea where the shadows kind of turn around that they've killed her. And that is very unfortunate. And Ged's raging. It is unfortunate and sad because the shadow of herself consumes her when she tries to tear free from its dominion. That's how she died, right? She couldn't break free of this mindset. So Ged is a hawk and he just flies and he's just going. And then we have this snippet where it flips over to Ogion. He's really described all so wonderfully. He's speaking to the trees, the spiders. There's a point where it said he refuses to speak to the lords, saying he'd like rather speak to nature. Ged stays in his hawk form and he lands on Ogion's arm. We learn that there are dire consequences for staying in another form for too long. In this case, it's the hawk. You can't stay in an animal form for too long, otherwise you'll just become an animal and forget yourself. But that also is symbolic for both Ged and Serret, right? Serret stayed evil too long, and then she couldn't come out of that form. She died when she tried to break free of that dominion because there was nothing left of her. Whereas Ged, Ogion will turn him back into a human and he will arise anew from hog form. He was able to catch it maybe early enough. He had enough set for him to where maybe he was lucky enough to realize I have a problem. Because if he didn't, all that was going to continue to happen was he was going to develop these negative aspects of him. And he was just going to become more and more prideful, more and more narcissistic, build a stronger ego. And at some point, there would be no going back. There would be no rectifying. And by the time he arrives, it turns out he had more or less forgotten himself. But what did he do? Well, he just returned to sort of grazing spots that he once knew. What does that represent? Well, Ged had only a tiny bit of his original self left. This small memory of this person from the island of God. Everything else, in some sense, he's forgotten. But there's this deep set identity that even in bird form, without consciously thinking about returning to this place, he returned to him because it was familiar. So there was a tiny bit of Ged left. He managed to change who he was right in time, just in time, because soon there was not going to be anything left. And unfortunately, in Serret's case, there was nothing left. And Ogion resides in the forest still. It seems clear that his affinity for the land may even be deeper. He recognizes Ged as he's turned into the falcon, and he knows who it is immediately. He turns him back. And right here, we see Ged as reborn. He's gone through this journey. He returns, and now he's reborn. He's a new person. And there's this powerful scene where Ged refers to Ogion as master. He realizes now, everything you said was right. I dismissed everything you said, willfully, ignorantly. And Ogion also believes that what Ged has been through shows, wow, he's changing. He is changed. He has a new power. He has choice. He's not constrained by this anymore. Now OG instructs Ged to stop running. Go face this thing. And we saw the literal face-off when he actually started attacking later. But he did it with his will intact. He consciously did it. And that's what Ogion instructs him to do. Hey, maybe you don't know what to do, but if you keep running, look what that shadow almost did to you. In some sense, that shadow almost drove him back into his pride, back into something he didn't want to be. He can't run. No, now's the time to face it. And then around the beginning of chapter 8, Ged gets a new boat, his own boat. And there's a few things here, because he can control his boat. He can use the wind. Remember, the direction of the wind as the direction of your moral decision making. What are your choices? But also, he's very slow now. He's patient. Like, he takes time with things. He takes time to fix the boat. He's not impulsive. It's more about letting things happen. He's starting to adopt this philosophy of Ogion. And initially, his goal is, okay, if I find this thing, I'll face it over sea, and we'll drown together, and that'll be the resolution. That's all I can aspire to. And also, I think the sea represents possibility, new mindsets, all kinds of belief. It's not landlocked, it's not rigid, it's not trapped. And so he's out hunting for the shadow, and he encounters it, and he turns his mage wind, and he barrels directly towards it. He's finding the problems within himself. Now he has the right morals, the correct insight to delve into himself, to lead him directly to the problem. However, as he gets close, it becomes misty. And this is like he's probing himself. He becomes lost in this internal fight. It's a little more confusing maybe than he thought. Since I think of this symbolically as maybe his arrogance is somehow synced up with all kinds of other parts of him, maybe that he didn't want to see, didn't want to know, and it's not as easy as just locating this singular shadow and just going straight for it. With the mage wind as his guide and his decision-making set true, he's able to clear the falcon. Obviously, it's not going to be so easy, so he runs into a rock. He's tossed into the waves. He's washed up on this tiny, tiny island in the middle of the ocean. And I think the land kind of represents solidity in this confusion and all this turmoil of the ocean. So there are two islanders on this tiny little island there in the middle of nowhere. We're told, never really met people in their entire lives. And so they're both afraid of each other, and they're kind to each other. and Ged stays until he recovers. As he's leaving, he receives a gift from them. And this gift is going to represent the ring of Erithakabe. It represents peace, a truce, but it turns out that these people are Kargish, and they fled from their homeland, and they landed in the middle of nowhere. It's interesting that in Ged's voyage after the shadow, which represents somewhat the exploration of himself, he runs into these Kargs. Well, do the Kargs have any significance for him? Well, yeah. Ged's pride and desire to use power were always there to curtail fear. And it all developed maybe as a trauma from this Kargish attack when he was young. So in this sense, what he realizes in chasing his shadow, exploring himself, is that he needs to come to peace with these people. So after he recovers, he begins to pursue the shadow once again. And I think he pursues it even deeper into the Kargish lands. He makes contact with the shadow, right? He turns around, it's in his boat, and he touches it. And then it kind of flees, and he realizes, wow, that was like the first time I was actually able to hurt it. What happened? In the internal conflict, what happened was he realized where his shadow came from. He identified the exact problem within himself, and he has turned the correct decision-making against it. So he has acknowledged it and figured out what it is. Now he can fight it. But it flees after he touched it. Once again, Ged is just proving that he's come full circle, and instead of dismissing allies, he actually goes on this last journey with the friend Vetch. The whole scene with Vetch is cool. Ged is hanging out with Vetch and Vetch's little sister, and it's a good scene. And as they're riding in the boat, we see another development from Ged. Maybe like the final development. He accurately deduces Vetch's sister's name. No one's ever told him. He didn't use deception. He didn't use force. He wasn't arrogant about it. And those were the things that he considered when he was trying to get the name of the doorman on Roke. He understood her in context with him, with Vetch, with the world that she's around. He found the harmony around her. He understood the balance. And right, that's the wizard's job in this, right? That's kind of Ogion's teaching. That's the wizard's job. And so now he understands the importance of what Ogion was teaching. Now you really know the name. Now you can figure these things out. So they kind of travel to the end of the world, and this somewhat represents the end, the depths, the boundary of his psyche. And he sees the shadow, and he just calls it by his name. He just says Ged, and then it falls under his control. All the trials that he's been through, he's proven that he's actually changing. He ran from it. He fought against it. He used his moral decision-making in the wind to turn against it. Once he finally figured out where it was inside him, he was able to touch it. He located it. And then all he had to do was kind of, in some sense, stand up tall, courageously, and say, hey, that's me. And it's always gonna be me. And I have to always keep it under control. And that's the reason the mages at Roke were telling him, well, you can't really run from it this time. That's because he has to learn the restraint. And he has learned the restraint. The shadow was just, the ignorance that he foisted onto the world through a specific action. And so once he finds the name, right, he comes back into balance. Everything about him balances out.